The presentation that I'll give will draw some on some work that I've done with my colleague Shahid Rashid of IFPRI as well. We've been working together on some issues related to stocks in Bangladesh recently. So I'm going to start with some general remarks about public stocks versus international trade, in particular private sector international trade. And then I want to talk about experiences of three countries and their experiences with holding stocks, with trying to promote food security and price stabilization. I'll talk about Bangladesh and their rice trade, and how their private sector imports and public stocks were complementary. They went together in stabilizing domestic markets. And that was a very happy story up until about 2007, and then Bangladesh was perhaps hit harder than any other country in the world with the later price shock. Then I'll talk about Pakistan. Again, they intervene heavily in their markets. They hold very large stocks. And I'll talk a little bit about the political economy, the issue related to domestic interests that push up the levels of procurement, the level of stock. And then very briefly, an illustration from Zambia relating to a policy that was designed to stabilize markets and that ends up destabilizing markets. Finally, some concluding observations. You're all familiar with these kinds of graphs. These are the nominal prices of cereals, 1960 to a little past 2008. And you see that in nominal terms, the prices vary tremendously. Rice is the one on the top, and it has the biggest fluctuations. And even in real terms, it's high. But again, one of the big points that I think many of us are familiar with is that the real prices in the international markets were considerably higher 30, 40 years ago, and that price shock that happened in the 70s was much more severe than what we have now. But this price spike in 2007-8 and then the subsequent volatility, there's been a lot of movement in the last few years, have caused many countries to rethink their policies about how much stock they should have, and to what extent can we rely at all on international trade. And that reminds me of the story of the third grade teacher trying to teach her students about the evils of drinking alcohol. And so she set up her science experiment, and there was one glass full of water and the other glass full of beer. And she took one worm and stuck it in the water, and the worm happily swam around at the bottom. And she stuck the other worm in the beer, and the worm shriveled up and died. And so she asked her class, "What lesson do you learn?" And a little boy raises his hand and he says, "If you don't want to get worms, you'd better drink a lot of beer." Well, the experiment worked, but it's not clear what we learned. We've all seen the big price fluctuation, so then the question is, what do we do after we've seen that? And so these high and volatile international prices suggest the need for larger public stocks, and particularly for rice, but also for wheat. However, there are substantial costs that could be involved. And I guess that's what I want to talk about, a little bit of cautionary tales about, yes, more stocks, this makes sense, but let's not forget about some of these other costs. The cost of the direct cost of storage facilities, loss of grain quality and storage, handling costs, etc. But in particular, also the possible disruption of private trade and storage. So very briefly, some general points. Of course, one alternative to reliance on trade is to increase domestic cereal supplies. IFPRI's done a lot of work over the years on the benefits of investments to agriculture. We heard a presentation just recently, earlier this afternoon, and that can have a lot of potential to increase availability of food, reduce the price, raise incomes, and so forth. But this idea of self-sufficiency isn't always desirable, and in some cases requires producing at higher costs, higher marginal costs than alternative supplies. And these expenditures for self-sufficiency can have high opportunity costs in terms of lost opportunities for investments, education, health, and so forth. So those are just some general observations, but then if we just turn to these examples, the experience of these three countries. In Bangladesh, the country liberalized its rice import trade in the early 90s. And in the 90s, Bangladesh benefited from that because in years of domestic production shortfalls, there were substantial private sector imports that brought grain into the country, rice into the country, and at no cost to the government, and helped stabilize prices. And in fact, there was a major flood in 1998, and private sector imports following that flood exceeded 200,000 tons a month for 7 consecutive months. 2/3 of that rice was coming in by truck, 10 to 12 tons per truck. That's a lot of trucks coming across the border from India, and that was private sector trade. And at the same time, while that private sector trade was happening, Bangladesh was able to maintain public food security stocks. They were able to maintain incentives for the private sector to import while having a substantial public food grain distribution. They were able to have stocks, safety nets, and liberalized trade together as complementary policies to support food security. But in mid-2007, world prices of cereals rose. You know that story. Poor harvests in a number of countries. India's harvests were a little bit down. The world price was rising, and so India put on a rice export ban. And India was the major source of supply for Bangladesh. Initially, they banned rice exports to Bangladesh. Ultimately, Bangladesh negotiated with India so that 1 million tons could flow. But what happened was that, does this do anything? How about that? Bangladesh prices, that's the red line there. And those are the domestic prices of rice in Bangladesh. And you can see that in the from 2005 through about 2007, incredibly stable rice prices that had everything to do with this trade with India, which, by the way, was subsidized by India at that time. But the story is that when that trade ended, the price in Bangladesh rose rapidly, and it rose above that relevant import parity price from before. It was still below the import parity price from Bangkok. In other words, even though the price was rising rapidly in Bangladesh, it was not profitable for the private sector to bring in grain from the international market, Thailand, or even Vietnam. The little blue bars here represent monthly imports in thousands of tons. And you can see that earlier in this period, there was a steady stream of imports coming across the border, and that our other work shows that that's what stabilized that price. But once that trade was disrupted, or there was the threat of that disruption, and once there was effectively a cap on the exports of rice to Bangladesh, the price of rice in Bangladesh rose rapidly and stayed high over that period. And then you can see subsequently Bangladesh's price has remained above that old import parity with India, but generally below international market prices. In other words, now you've only got a trickle of rice coming, and that's because the incentives for bringing in that rice are small. So we looked at what happened in 2007-08 to Bangladesh. And at that time, they'd had a bit of a production shortfall themselves, and there was a gap between domestic supply and domestic demand at the previous real prices of the year before. And that gap was estimated at around 2 million tons. In other words, and that was equivalent to roughly 10% of a 6-month domestic supply. That's a little bit low, maybe 15%. The Bangladesh government, as I said, ultimately arranged for those imports, and also it had some stocks and was able to put an additional 700,000 tons onto the market. As you can see, that action did prevent the price from going up all the way to, say, at that time, the import parity with Thailand, but there was a substantial price increase. And so we did some analysis, a little partial equilibrium model of this, and it suggested that excess private stock holding probably contributed to this increase in rice prices, and that if the government had, in fact, had timely interventions early on in this, it would have been possible to calm those markets, greatly reduce that price rise. Bottom line is Bangladesh got caught short. It was relying on international trade with India. The trade was disrupted. They were able to negotiate again, but that scared the markets in Bangladesh, and ultimately there was a substantial price increase. Moving on to Pakistan then, very briefly. In Pakistan, there are big wheat market interventions. Domestic procurement happens at a fixed support price in excess of open market prices, and there's a lot of pressure. It's a political decision what that procurement price will be, and the large farmers who sell wheat to government benefit most. And in Pakistan, you may know the land distribution is quite unequal. There are also significant losses in government storage, high cost of handling and transport. And then in this system, the government is selling the wheat it buys at below cost. Not only that, it's selling it at fixed release prices below open market prices to flour mills, so that the subsidy doesn't really reach the consumers. Here's a look at what happened to Pakistan's stock. This top line is an estimate of the stock levels at the maximum, right after they procure the next season's crop. And you can see that here at the end of this period, there was enormous pressure to procure more grain, and the Pakistan government ended up with stocks in excess of 10 million tons, record levels of stocks. Again, domestic pressure to procure that grain. And remember, they're buying the grain at above market prices, they're selling the grain to flour mills at below market prices, they're incurring a loss on every unit sold, and in the end, you get massive financial losses. 30 seconds for Zambia. In Zambia, the government wanted to intervene. Instead of relying on private sector imports, they were going to intervene, and they announced that they would have large-scale public imports. Ultimately, they failed to deliver on their own promise of importing maize. In the end, you end up with domestic supply less than it would have been if they had simply let the private sector import the maize. So, the big price shocks and the subsequent price instability suggests the need for public stocks, additional public stocks to ensure cereal availability. There was a good case for some public stocks before. The case is even a little bit stronger now that we've seen how unstable the world market is. However, it still remains important to have these complementary policies of public stocks and imports, perhaps private sector imports. And in order to have these complementary policies, we need three things. We need to maintain incentives for domestic production and private sector trade. If you want the private sector to help stabilize the markets, we need to maintain those incentives. It's very important for there to be transparent and consistent government policy to give clear signals to farmers, traders, and consumers. That's not what happened in Zambia. It is what happened in the past in Bangladesh. especially in the late 90s. And then finally, any country that allows this private sector trade is going to want to monitor those markets even more to make sure that the prices are moving well, and to have an understanding of the level of imports that are likely to come in and where this country's prices are relative to the most recent movements in the international markets. Thank you.